The women of Cedar Valley had a name for Abigail Foster, one they used with a particular cruelty small communities reserve for anyone who fails to fit the shape expected of her, and that name was the Spinster, spoken sometimes with pity and sometimes with a thin cutting edge of mockery, but always with the same underlying assumption that a woman of 32 who had never married had somehow failed at the one task that mattered most in a woman's life. Abigail had stopped flinching at the word years before, had built around herself a quiet dignity that let the whispers pass through her like wine through a fence, because she had made her peace, or told herself she had, with the path her life had taken, running the small schoolhouse library and the town's modest lending collection, tending her aging mother until her passing 2 winters back, and filling the empty hours of a life without husband or children with the books she loved and the garden she kept with more care than anyone else in the valley gave theirs. She had turned down 2 proposals in her 20s, both from perfectly decent men she simply had not loved, and had watched. Without regret exactly, but with a certain wistfulness she rarely allowed herself to examine too closely, as those same men married other women and raised families while she remained alone in the small house at the edge of town that had once belonged to her parents. She told herself frequently that she had chosen this life, that independence suited her better than the compromises of a marriage built on convenience rather than affection, and mostly she believed it, except on the particular evenings when the town's lamps lit up in windows full of families gathered for supper, and her own house sat dark and quiet, holding nothing but herself and her books. Daniel Whitmore had come to Cedar Valley 3 years before Abigail's story properly began, a widower with a young daughter named Clara, having lost his wife to a wagon accident back in Kansas before uprooting what remained of his small family to try building something new on land he'd bought sight unseen in Montana territory. He was a capable rancher, well liked around town for his quiet honesty and his evident devotion to his daughter, but he was also, by his own admission to the few friends he'd made in the valley, a man drowning quietly in the particular loneliness of raising a child alone while trying to build a ranch from nothing, grief for his late wife tangled up with the daily exhaustion of being both mother and father to a little girl who asked, more often than he knew how to answer, why she didn't have a mama like the other children at church. Clara was 6 when Abigail first properly met her, a shy, watchful child who'd inherited her father's quiet steadiness and her late mother's dark curling hair, and their first real encounter happened not through any deliberate introduction, but through the accident of Clara wandering into the schoolhouse library one rainy afternoon while her father settled a business matter at the general store next door. Drawn in by the sight of shelves lined with books she could not yet read but wanted, with an intensity that struck Abigail immediately, to understand. Abigail found the girl standing in the doorway, dripping slightly from the rain, staring at the shelves with an expression of such open longing that Abigail set aside the ledger she'd been working on and asked, gently, whether the girl would like to come in and look properly. What began as a simple kindness, pulling down a picture book and reading aloud while they waited for Clara's father to notice his daughter's absence and come looking, became, over the following months, a habit neither of them quite planned but both came to treasure. Clara finding excuses to visit the library whenever her father's errands brought them into town, Abigail setting aside books she thought the girl might enjoy, patiently teaching her letters during the quiet hours when no other patrons required her attention. Daniel, when he eventually came to collect his daughter from these visits, was struck each time by how completely Clara had opened up in Abigail's company, this shy child who guarded her affections carefully since her mother's death, chattering easily about stories and letters with a woman she'd known only a matter of weeks, and he found himself lingering longer than his errands strictly required, drawn by curiosity at first and then, gradually, by something he was slower to name. The friendship that grew between Daniel and Abigail over that first year was built on the unglamorous foundation of shared concern for a child's well-being rather than any grand romantic beginning. Conversations at first entirely about Clara's progress with her letters or her curious questions about the world. The two adults falling into an easy rapport that neither had expected from what began as polite small talk during a father's wait for his daughter. Abigail found herself, for the first time in years, looking forward to something beyond the quiet rhythm of her solitary days, watching for the Whitmore wagon coming into town, and Daniel found himself, more often than his ranch work strictly justified, inventing reasons to bring Clara into town for library visits that had less to do with his daughter's education, and more to do with his own growing eagerness to spend an hour in Abigail's company. Neither of them spoke of this shift directly for a long while, both cautious for their own reasons, Daniel wary of moving too quickly after the depth of grief his wife's death had left in him. Abigail wary of hoping for something she'd trained herself for years not to want, having watched enough of her own hopes disappointed in her 20s to distrust the particular warmth she felt whenever Daniel's wagon appeared on the road into town. It was Clara, in the end, who forced the matter into the open, with a particular fearless directness only a child possesses, on an afternoon some 14 months into the friendship when she asked Abigail, apropos of nothing during one of their library sessions, whether Abigail would like to come to supper at the ranch, because Clara had decided, with a child's simple logic, that the two people she loved most in the world beyond her father ought to spend time together properly rather than only in the borrowed hours of library visits. Abigail, caught off guard, deferred the question to Daniel, assuming the invitation had not been sanctioned by him. But when Daniel arrived to collect his daughter and heard what Clara had proposed, he did not correct or apologize for it, only asked, with a hesitancy Abigail had not seen in him before, whether she would in fact be willing to come, because he found, saying the words aloud, that he wanted this rather badly himself, and had simply lacked his daughter's courage in asking directly. That first supper at the Whitmore Ranch began a new chapter in all three of their lives, Abigail finding herself increasingly woven into the fabric of their small household, invited back the following week and the week after that, until the visits became a settled and expected rhythm that none of them examined too closely for fear of naming it and thereby somehow disturbing its fragile, growing warmth. Clara blossomed under the steady presence of a woman who read to her patiently and answered her endless questions without impatience, and it was perhaps 3 months into this new rhythm, on an evening when Abigail had stayed later than usual helping put Clara to bed, that the girl, drowsy and drifting toward sleep, reached up and hugged Abigail tightly around the neck and murmured, with the unguarded honesty of a child on the edge of sleep, that she loved her, and that she wished Abigail could be her mother properly, the way she was starting to feel like she already was. Abigail, standing in the small bedroom with tears she could not entirely suppress, understood in that moment that whatever careful boundaries she had maintained around her own hopes had been thoroughly and irrevocably dismantled by a 6-year-old's simple, devastating honesty. Daniel, standing in the doorway and having overheard his daughter's words, did not pretend afterward that he hadn't heard them, and the two adults sat together on the porch that night in a conversation that finally named what both had been circling for months. He told Abigail plainly that he had come to love her, not as a replacement for the wife he'd lost, but as her own person entirely, a woman whose quiet steadiness and evident love for his daughter had done more to heal his household than he had believed possible when he'd first arrived in this valley a grieving widower. Abigail, who had spent a decade being called a spinster by a town that assumed her unmarried state reflected some deficiency in her rather than simply the absence, until now, of a man and a child worth building a life around, told him in turn that she loved him too, had loved him for longer than she'd allowed herself to admit, and that Clara's declaration had only put into words a truth her own heart had been keeping quiet for months out of fear rather than doubt. Their courtship, once it moved into the open, was conducted with a particular scrutiny small towns reserve for any romance involving a widely known figure like the valley's presumed permanent spinster, and Abigail found herself, in those months, the subject of a very different kind of talk than she'd grown accustomed to, no longer pity for a woman who'd failed to marry but a kind of startled reassessment among the town's gossips, several of whom found themselves privately, and sometimes not so privately, admitting that they'd misjudged her all along. Not everyone in the valley extended this reassessment graciously. There remained a faction of older women who felt some obscure sense of propriety violated by a widower courting a woman so firmly established in the town's collective imagination as unmarriageable, whispers suggesting Abigail had somehow schemed her way into Daniel's affections through her access to his motherless daughter, an accusation that stung precisely because it inverted the truth so completely, the affection between Abigail and Clara having grown entirely organically, months before Daniel's own feelings had entered the equation at all. Abigail bore this renewed scrutiny with the same quiet dignity she'd maintained through years of being called a spinster, refusing to let it poison what she had found, and Daniel, for his part, made plain to anyone who raised the matter in his hearing that he would not tolerate gossip about the woman he intended to marry, a declaration that did more than anything else to quiet the whispers once word of his intentions spread properly through the valley. They were married the following harvest season, in a ceremony at the small church Abigail had attended her whole life, The same building where she had sat through years of sermons about womanly duty and domestic virtue while privately wondering whether such virtues would ever be asked of her, and where she now stood at the altar in a modest blue dress, Clara serving as her flower girl with an expression of such radiant, unrestrained joy that several of the older women who'd once whispered about the spinster of the valley found themselves unexpectedly moved to tears. The wedding supper afterward, held at the Whitmore Ranch with the whole valley in attendance, marked something more than the union of two adults. It marked the formal completion of a family that had, in truth, been forming for over a year already in the quiet accumulation of library afternoons and shared suppers and a little girl's unwavering patient love. Clara, that evening, insisted on introducing Abigail to every guest not as her father's new wife but as her mother, a designation she had clearly been rehearsing with some anticipation, and Abigail, hearing the word applied to herself so freely and so proudly by the child who had first opened this whole unexpected chapter of her life, found herself unable to speak for a long moment, overwhelmed by a happiness she had genuinely believed, for the better part of a decade, was simply not going to be hers. The years that followed brought their own hard-won proof that the family Clara had wished into being that sleepy evening was no fragile or temporary arrangement, but a lasting bond built on the same steady foundation that had characterized their whole courtship. Abigail gave up her position at the schoolhouse library, though she brought a considerable portion of her personal collection to the ranch house, building a small library of her own in what had once been an unused parlor, a room Clara came to treat as her favorite place in the entire house, and where the two of them continued the reading sessions that had first drawn them together, now extended to two more children Abigail and Daniel had together over the following years. Siblings Clara doted on with the fierce protective love of an eldest child who remembered, better than the younger ones ever would, what it had felt like to grow up without a mother's steady presence. The harvest each year became, in the Whitmore household, something of a family tradition beyond its practical necessity, all five of them working the fields together when the children grew old enough to help, Abigail having learned ranch work with the same patient determination she'd once applied to teaching a small girl her letters, and Daniel never failing, each harvest season, to tell his wife that the true harvest of his life had not been any crop brought in from the fields but the family that had grown, slowly and improbably, out of a rainy afternoon when his daughter had wandered into a schoolhouse library and found there, waiting without either of them knowing it yet, the woman who would become her mother in every way that mattered. Abigail Foster, who had once been called the spinster of Cedar Valley by women who mistook her solitude for failure, lived to see that old cruel nickname fade entirely from the town's memory, replaced by a new and gentler kind of local legend. The story told at harvest suppers and quilting circles for a generation afterward of the schoolteacher who had waited, without ever quite believing she was waiting, for exactly the family that needed her, and who had found, in the end, that it is never too late for love to arrive in whatever unexpected form it chooses, so long as a person keeps her heart open enough, even after years of disappointment, to recognize it when a small girl's hand finally reaches for hers in a rain-soaked doorway and does not let go.